Let's go.
You're listening to Making Data Simple, where we make the world of data effortless, relevant, and yes, even fun.
Hey, podcast listeners, Al Martin here. You have made it back to Making Data Simple. Thank you for that. With me today, I have Aaron Cooper, who is an attorney. He serves as the Senior Vice President of Global Policy at BSA, which is Business Software Alliance. In his role, Cooper leads BSA's Global Policy team. There we go. We'll try it again. This includes data privacy, cybersecurity, AI regulation, data flows, and digital trade. He tends to testify before Congress. Interesting, and is a frequent speaker on data governance and other issues important to the software industry. Now, BSA, that's the Software Alliance as I know it, a leading advocate for the global software industry before governments and in the international marketplace. I think their headquarters in Washington, D.C. I believe, Aaron, that is where you are, and you have operations in more than 30 countries. Welcome to the podcast. We're so glad to have you here. Thank you
very much. It's great to be here.
Fantastic. Well, look, I kind of butchered that to start. If you wouldn't mind, I'd like to hear from you. I mean, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself, and then tell us about BSA.
All right. Well, thank you. So about me, I mean, right now, as you mentioned, I run the Global Policy Program for BSA. BSA is a trade association that represents the enterprise-facing part of the software industry. So companies like IBM, companies like Salesforce and Okta and Oracle and Microsoft, companies that are primarily providing business-to-business software solutions. And we have operations around the world, and we can talk a little bit more about what AI regulation looks like around the world as we go on. But my background is actually in Congress. So I worked for nearly a decade for the person who was then the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Patrick Leahy. And the Judiciary Committee covers a lot of very partisan issues like immigration reform, judicial nominations, criminal laws, things like that. But they also cover really bipartisan issues like intellectual property and antitrust. And fortunately for me, those were the issues for which I was the chief counsel. So I worked on IP and antitrust proposals, legislation for about 8 years. And it really gives an opportunity to work with counterparts on the other side of the aisle, which on so many issues, especially these days, is not really an easy thing to do. But with IP issues and with antitrust, there's a lot of commonality between Democrats and Republicans. And it gave us an opportunity to work with the tech sector, with other parts of the entertainment industry, the creative community, the technology sector, pharmaceuticals, and really try to figure out how the IP rules can work for everyone. So that was my background. As I said, I did that for about 8 years, and it gave me a really interesting perspective, I thought, on the way different industries experience the IP system. And I became fascinated with the companies that were the members of BSA at the time. I worked a lot with IBM, among others. And what I really enjoyed about working with them was sort of two things. One was seeing how important the enterprise software industry is to every other industry sector. And the other was that these are companies that are solution oriented. So rather than going into Congress and saying, never pass anything that's going to regulate us or get rid of all regulation, they were trying to understand what the problems were that Congress was trying to address and figure out a constructive way of addressing them. So when I had an opportunity to come work for BSA, working on global policy, I jumped at the opportunity. While BSA for many years focused a lot on those IP issues, and we still do focus on IP issues to a certain extent, over the near decade that I've been at BSA, the types of issues that our companies have focused on has really transitioned. So today, most of the time, we're talking about artificial intelligence, and I'm sure we're going to talk a little bit more about it on this podcast. But cybersecurity, the evolution and migration to the cloud, privacy issues, cross-border data transfers, these are the core issues that enable cloud service providers and those that are developing or implementing AI solutions that are really important to them in order to be successful and enable all those other sectors in the economy to succeed.
Wow, nicely done. All right. So there's a lot of things to go through there. By the way, we talk about everything, and I'm interested in everything. But I will say the people that have reached out to us most as of late have been really under the AI umbrella. On one hand, it's like, all right, there's a lot of other things that I hold interest in. On the other hand, once you get into AI, we start talking about governance, we talk about data. So it's really lends itself to all kinds of technology that feed into AI. Now, the funny thing is, before we started this podcast, we were joking around that I like to orchestrate these podcasts as like we just met in a bar and we're going to talk about, just what everybody wants to hear about, essentially. And you were like, oh, well, regulation and that kind of thing is boring. But I can tell you right now, that it's not going to be boring at all. And you know why? I'm going to prove it to you right now because I'm going to jump right in. I'm going to start. You're in Washington, D.C. on November 5th, Election Day. What's that like?
It really is it's the calm before the storm. I think every day leading up to November 5th, and I think this is true not just every 4 years, but every 2 years, leading up to the first Tuesday in November, everybody around here is clicking refresh on whatever their favorite polling site is constantly. But when it gets to Election Day, clicking on that link doesn't do anything anymore because it's the real day. And so it really is, I think there's a big sense of calm at the moment. And as the first exit polls start to come in this evening, that will certainly change, and people will either be hunkered down or at parties, depending on how they handle these kinds of events. But during the day on the first Tuesday of November, it's actually quite quiet.
So it's quiet today. You actually went into the office. I thought you would use that as an excuse to say, I'm staying home and staying out of the riffraff.
No, not today.
So any other unique perspectives being in Washington, D.C. while we're having Election Day and given your involvement or direct involvement with government? We don't have to get political here, but I'm just asking, just what your overall perspective is.
Well, I think it's a much bigger focus than it would be anywhere else for obvious reasons, just because of where we sit. I mean, in addition to a change in the administration, regardless of who wins, which means a lot of change in personnel, regardless of who wins. Mm-hmm. There's also our office is very close to the Senate, and there are 33 seats up in the Senate and all 435 in the House. There's going to be a lot of change throughout the city.
Now, what worries you most, or I don't know if the worry is the word, what are the topics that resonate with you most as it relates to the Software Alliance, no matter what party we're talking about?
So I think that one of the things that's nice about the issues that we work on is that in addition to there being kind of emerging issues, they're not as well baked as some other issues are because the technology is still emerging. They're also not highly partisan. So certainly, depending on who wins the presidency, there's going to be a different way that they talk about AI. But I think overall, the interest of government, whether you're Democrat or Republican, is in making sure that the U.S. can maintain a leadership position on AI, but that the way AI is developed is responsible and leads to the kinds of technology that industries and the public can trust and put to use.
So it doesn't matter to you from a business perspective what topics are front and center. They're all going to be dealing with these like equally?
Regardless of who wins, they're going to focus on the key issues that we focus on as well. Whereas maybe 5 years ago, I think a lot of tech issues were slightly under the radar, weren't going to make the front page of the papers. That's not true anymore. I think with artificial intelligence in particular, they are. So there's going to be an interest from either administration, and regardless of who is in control in Congress, in looking at AI regulation and wanting to make sure that it achieves those two objectives: maintaining U.S. leadership, making sure that the way AI is developed is responsible. Then I think there's also going to be a big focus on cybersecurity, on the ability to transfer data around the world, both to be able to detect cyber threats, but also just to make cloud computing and the U.S. economy work. So I really think that there's a lot of commonality between parties on these issues, but we're going to see, I think, an increase in focus on AI over the next 4 years, regardless of who wins, just because the technology is becoming so important to the overall economy.
So you represent the alliance, all these companies that are part of this alliance.
Yes.
Right? Given that, as you're representing the alliance, why the need for the alliance? Independently, is it not sufficient to stand in front of Congress? we need the alliance to essentially create more, it's like a union almost, an impactful force? Or is it also about gaining your mind share and the BSA's mind share to really educate the alliance? Tell me more about the overall makeup of the alliance, I guess is what my...
It's a combination of several of those things that you said. So we are a trade association of enterprise-focused software companies. On the core issues that we focus on, AI, cybersecurity, privacy, cross-border data transfers, and intellectual property, we will do a combination of trying to create consensus positions within the industry and do the advocacy on that. So we are both taking mind share from our companies. So companies can help us in understanding what is important to them on those issues. And I'm fortunate to be part of an organization that has a very expert team that can also help drive those conversations in order to create consensus positions for the industry, which then when we go to Congress, to state governments, to the executive branch, and overseas where we also do work on policy issues, we can bring a cohesive voice to policymakers, which also helps with their efforts to try to figure out what responsible regulations look like.
I have a question on consensus, but before I go there, how do you define success?
Continuing to create a legal landscape where a company like IBM can develop and deploy new technological solutions in a responsible manner, but can then pursue the business model that they have in mind. So it's creating the right kinds of guardrails that are globally consistent so that you're not dealing with completely incompatible laws in the European Union, the UK, the US, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and so on. And that all those laws work in a way that elevates everybody's game so that companies across the sector are living by the same rules to develop the most secure, privacy protective, responsible solutions.
Well, so that brings me back to consensus. Do you spend more time gathering consensus across the alliance itself or influencing Congress?
So we do both. And I think both of them take time. What we try to do is get out in front of issues as best we can. So that will take some time with members up front. That way, when we go to, again, Congress or the administration or state governments overseas, we have something constructive that we can go to them with. I'll give you a concrete example of this. So 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, as we were starting to think about what are the AI issues that governments are going to want to tackle, one clear one that was coming up was going to be making sure that AI doesn't exacerbate problems of bias and discrimination. And so we worked with companies before there were proposed regulations on this subject to come up with what's a risk management framework that is consistent with best practices within the industry and that would start to achieve the objectives that we envision coming from policymakers.
The only thing is, I would imagine, and I mean, just outside in, I would imagine gathering that consensus is very difficult. Everybody has different interpretations of what AI is, what it should be in the future. By example, there are many, and I talk about this on the podcast all the time, and people roll their eyes, and I'll talk about it again, is like large language models that are just scraping the internet, bringing in copyrighted material, everything under the sun. There are others that are against that. So I guess what I'm trying to say in the context of this discussion, I would imagine you'd have all different companies with different perspectives that impact their bottom line that are trying to influence you to influence that consensus. It would seem like getting that consensus would be equally as hard as influencing Congress.
So it actually, I think because we make sure that our membership is focused on enterprise software and it's not the entire tech industry, it's still a challenge. The more detailed we get, the harder it is to find consensus. But we found that on almost every issue that we work on, we've been able to get into a pretty good level of detail, partly because we we have enough expertise in-house that we can help drive some of those conversations in a way where our members trust us. And in part because we're discussing it among similar kinds of software companies, there's less of a likelihood that there'll be misunderstandings about what different companies are trying to do. I think when all these conversations play out just in Congress and it's not done in a sort of more neutral space, you can often have misunderstandings. So one company hears a buzzword and thinks one thing, another company hears that buzzword and thinks something really different, and everybody thinks that it's if it's not their buzzword, it's intended to get them in some way. But we found that we can avoid that by discussing it internally and trying to understand our company's business model and then drive business models and then drive solutions based on the expertise that we have in-house.
So is that to say, I mean, just to summarize that, you can usually find commonality and consensus when you're working with these companies, because they all want to be able to achieve success, and the best way to do that is a collective influence. True?
Yes, and similar business models, and that's important. And we have companies that are not afraid of regulation as long as it's reasonable and responsible regulation. So we can be more proactive in suggesting things to policymakers rather than just saying no.
Well, then let me flip the script on the policymaker side. I got to believe a lot of politics are involved one way or another. Some are more regulation, some are less regulation. You find that achievable, or you're wanting to pull your hair out? Like, well, you got your hair, so maybe you're okay. Maybe it's not that difficult.
Yeah. So, I having worked on the Hill for nearly a decade, I feel like I can say it is not. You never go wrong betting against the possibility of legislation passing, but because these issues play out in so many different fora, so it's not just Congress. It's also what's the administration going to do. What are state governments going to do? And state governments are passing AI laws already, Colorado last year. And what's the European Union going to do, in the UK and Japan and so on? That there are so many places where there are active legislative or regulatory conversations that we know there will be new rules that companies are going to have to abide by, already on privacy, of course, now also a few on AI, a lot on cybersecurity and so on. So that while there are going to be differences of opinion on the Hill about passing legislation that creates new regulatory frameworks, there are also going to be new laws that companies have to comply with. And so trying to make sure that those are as consistent as possible is one of the key objectives that we have. And as you asked at the beginning, one of those things that we measure success by. Can we create consistency in a reasonable way?
So if you're talking data privacy, cybersecurity, AI regulation, I think the common consensus is that the European Union is well ahead of the U.S. Now, the question is, let me pause for that for a second. I tend to be anti-regulation, but you got to have some regulation. It depends on how you regulate it, I guess, is the big question. So I guess it's a two-part question. Do you see the European Union as far ahead of the U.S. and why? And well, let me stop there. I'll ask that before I ask the second question.
Well, I mean, they have a tendency to regulate first. I don't think there's any.
Well, I don't know if that makes it right. That's what I'm saying. So
exactly. So it doesn't make it right or wrong. I think that there are legitimate things that they are trying to regulate for, or they're trying to protect against, and increasingly we see those same things in the U.S. states, where we've got 30 or so. I think we're up to close to 30 state privacy laws. We're going to have a slew of AI laws coming next year. Already had a couple pass this last year. And as long as we can identify, I think what's important in terms of good policy making is identifying what it is that policymakers are trying to address, and then find a way to address those issues without having unintended consequences. That's tricky because you're always going to either over or under regulate to a certain extent. But there are, I think, with AI as a good example, there are some things like trying to prevent discrimination in the use of AI that everybody can get behind. And then the question is, how do we best achieve that? And I think that where a lot of governments are starting to settle is creating some requirement for those that are developing high risk uses, or developing AI for high risk use cases, or using it in a high risk situation like a hiring decision or a housing decision, to take steps up front to make sure we're mitigating the possibility of bias.
So, what is the prevailing point of view then, whether it's AI or cybersecurity, on how solutions, for lack of a better term, should be regulated?
Whether we're talking, like you said, cyber or AI in particular, in both cases, you really want to take a risk-based approach. So there's not one size fits all for the way regulation should look, but that where I'm going to use AI as I think the most prominent example at the moment, where you know that AI is going to be used to aid in a loan decision. You're taking steps to identify where your data is coming from, what the potential for bias or discrimination might be, and then taking appropriate steps to mitigate those risks. But you can't dictate exactly how to identify or mitigate the risks, because it's going to be different for every use case and for every development technique with AI. So we need to have a flexible approach, but one that has actual requirements on companies to take proactive steps, in addition to it then being illegal if discrimination results, right? That's the law, whether you're using an AI system or not. But I think everyone is, at least within our community, getting to the point of saying there should also be ex ante requirements on companies to put guardrails in place to mitigate the risk.
I think guardrails are fine, but I'll just go out on a limb and I'll tell you my concern. My concern is that regulation is assigned to the algorithms themselves. And my concern there is that we'll end up regulating science versus the use case or the solution those algorithms are drawing up, which in my mind certainly be regulated if they're doing something nefarious in that solution, but not the science underneath, because that'll impact other innovation, with other very valid solutions. Does that make sense?
Yes, and I think most of the risk management frameworks that we've seen, certainly the one we put together, the one that came from NIST here in the Department of Commerce, focuses on guardrails that are put in place that identify risk and mitigate it, but are not about the underlying technology.
Is that the prevailing thought then, or are there naysayers on that too?
I think, at least with respect to trying to combat discrimination in those high risk situations, that is, I think, where the prevailing interest is. And then what we spend a lot of time with policymakers on within that rubric is how do we make sure that the steps that companies need to take are appropriate to their role in the process. So, for instance, if you're the one that knows where the training data came from and you can identify whether it is perpetuating historical discrimination, there are steps that you should take there. But you might not know what decisions your customer is making about who gets a loan and who doesn't get a loan. So you can't do the analysis there. In fact, your customer might say, I don't want you to know any of that information. We're not going to allow you to look at it. But that customer should have some obligations to make sure that in practice, the way the AI system is being used is not creating a discriminatory effect.
What's your view on state versus federal?
Well, we always want to have as much consistency both within the US and then globally as we possibly can. So to the extent that we can get a strong, good, reasonable federal law, that's what we've been advocating. But states are moving faster, and so we are active in every state where there's comprehensive AI legislation being proposed, and we want to make sure that works as best it can until there's a federal law.
Are you only focused on federal?
No, we're federal, state, global. We're active everywhere.
Tell me the global landscape then. That seems like immensely challenging. We can't even get the U.S. together in many cases, yet trying to get agreement, particularly when you got the European Union that's well ahead, depends on how you define that, but they got more regulation, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So I think there's always resistance to change or being influenced, certainly backwards. I mean, I don't often see regulation being removed. I see more being added. That's maybe my contrarian view. I don't know. But my point is, getting all worldwide countries to align outside of just a very slim sliver on top, I would see would almost be unachievable. I don't know.
So you're not going to get identical legislation everywhere, right? That's not practical, and it shouldn't be, because you have different
Values.
norms and values and expectations in different places. But what we want to see is as much consistency and interoperability as possible. So I'll give you an example. The GDPR, the privacy law in Europe, which has been there for 7-8 years now, we don't want to see a carbon copy of that in the US. But the same structure that we see in the GDPR is something that we now see in Virginia, Connecticut, 20 some odd other states. What's helpful about that is that you can create one compliance program and apply it broadly. That there'll be additional, like the US, and certainly individual states don't have cross-border data restrictions the way the GDPR does. And there are going to be other things that are in the GDPR that don't make sense in a US system. But the general structure of it is what we want to make sure we see consistency in other places.
How do you regulate without stifling innovation?
Well, I think that what good regulation can do is protect consumers and encourage responsible development in a way that then leads to more uptake of the technology, which leads to a good virtuous cycle. If you have a bunch of companies developing solutions with no security protections, that might work well for year one. But in year 2 through however many other, no one's going to adopt those solutions because they can't be kept secure. So having rules that help elevate everyone's game is helpful in having the entire ecosystem trusted more, and therefore you'll have more uptake of the technology.
I'm thinking about that. I mean, the one concern that I always have is like we talked about, different countries have different values. I often find that the more data you have, the better statistical relevance you'll have, the better the AI can be. So I guess sometimes more regulation, if a government can control your data, can provide better innovation. But that's a privacy issue, certainly in the US and many other countries. It seems like there's very inconsistency there, and it could turn into an arms race.
An arms race in the sense of
I mean, the one example that I often use, that if we were to use it for AI for healthcare, predicting infectious diseases or something like that, if I have control of everybody's DNA, I can really get to end of job pretty quick. But for very good reason, people in the US will not want to give up their DNA, but that means they could be grossly behind other countries in scientific advancement around healthcare if they don't do so. It's a weird dilemma that we've never faced before.
But I think that it's important that those values that we have in the US, and there'll be different value systems in other places, are a key component of how we think about what public policy and regulation should look like. And ultimately, I think that it goes to the benefit of not just companies like BSA members that are developing the technology, but to every other industry sector that is going to benefit from being able to use the technology because they can trust it more than they otherwise could. And I think overall that makes the entire ecosystem better. And I think that has worked well for the US. We don't have a national privacy law, but we now have a lot of state privacy laws. We have a lot of rules coming on board with respect to cybersecurity. And I think these things don't take away from the ability to innovate. I think that they benefit companies that take security, privacy, non-discrimination seriously.
Just to restate, and it's also the way I would answer it, more people trust AI, more people use AI. It's based on their value system. The U.S. has always found a way to innovate, and will be able to still stay in front based on that, our level of innovation. You're looking at all this regulation, you're looking at cybersecurity, you're working with the Alliance, some of the biggest enterprise companies in the world. If I was to push you and say, what are you fearful of right now, given everything that's going on, what would you tell me?
I think one of the biggest things for companies to worry about is that there will be another company that operates really irresponsibly. And when that company creates a tool that doesn't operate as intended, whether that means that it creates a discriminatory effect if we're talking about AI in a hiring decision, or it's connected vehicle that doesn't have proper security controls and is easily hacked and leads to physical harm in the world. Things that are not situations where companies are not taking responsible steps to develop their software securely and to mitigate risk, whether it's about bias or about the risk of security breaches, causing harm in the world will create reputational problems throughout the industry that are going to be hard to overcome. I remember IBM saying this and thinking that it really resonated, that if you can't explain it, you shouldn't be selling it. And I think that's a good way of looking at it. And the flip side is, I think companies that are licensing it, buying the solutions, also want to make sure that they have an explanation about how it's trained and that it's trained responsibly before they want to incorporate it into their products and services.
Going back to fears, any fears specific to cybersecurity?
Yes, I think security continues to be a huge issue, and it's both when there are malicious actors that can easily get into a system because the system wasn't developed properly, and also if the system's not developed properly and it just doesn't work right. So I think both of those situations are definitely cause for concern, and not everybody goes through a life cycle approach to software security development. But I think that's one thing that a lot of governments are now trying to ratchet up the way companies are developing software, because IBM can do a fantastic job with its software security development lifecycle management. But if another company is not developing software securely and it leads to a real problem in the physical world, I think the reputational hit on all software is a real thing to worry about. And so the more we can raise the bar for everyone, the more secure we can make sure that all software is developed, the better the entire industry will be.
If we meet a year from now, what will have changed?
Well, we're not going to have 80-degree days on November 5th.
Are you sure?
I'm not sure, but you asked me to predict.
Okay.
We'll have a new administration no matter what, so that one's easy to predict.
Yes.
I think that two things. One, a lot more state governments will have passed AI rules. I think that other...
Pause in there for a second. Does that mean the federal is behind states? No, I heard you say states. But does that mean they're behind, or you think that's the sequence of events that should happen? States go first, federal come in and then determine.
I think that's what's likely to happen. I'm on prediction.
All right, you're on prediction. Okay.
I think that there will be increasing focus on AI around the world. It's just going to continue. And then I think there's the unknowable at the moment, which is what's the next wave of technology that is going to change the way we think about regulation. So, for instance, the AI Act in Europe was 85% of the way done when ChatGPT was released publicly, and then that started to change part of what the EU wanted to regulate at the very end. What's that technology change going to be next time around, maybe within the next year? And is it going to be based on quantum computing, or is it going to be based on further developments in artificial intelligence? And I think there are a lot of possibilities, but they are all unknown at this from a policy perspective.
Is there any reason to believe that governments can stay on pace with the innovation?
But I think that's where having a risk-based approach that relies on impact assessments, risk management frameworks, whether we're talking about privacy, AI, cybersecurity, or quantum computing, can be really helpful, because it doesn't need to specifically regulate the way technology exists at a moment in time, but instead can focus on processes that get you to where you want to go.
So going back to my original questions, I know you were doing the prediction. Do you think the federal level should drive the regulation, or do you think it's fine putting it in the hands largely of the states, or where's your head out there?
I think if there could be one federal law that was well drafted and tailored and provided protections, and also if we had one good federal law, that's the best way to go. But I understand why states want to regulate in the absence of of Congress moving on legislation. But I think ideally there's one federal law.
Will we ever have that? We're never going to have that, are we?
We're going to keep pushing for it.
So this time next year, your prediction, you're bringing out the crystal ball. We're going to have it then?
I think I was predicting that there would be more states that have.
I know you predict states, you didn't, so I don't think we'll have it. Oh, 3 years? You think we'll have it 3 years?
We're going to keep pushing for it.
I'm on this kick, so I'm going to keep it going. What's true and nobody believes you on? This should be good with regulation, with responsible AI.
Does it have to be nobody believes?
Oh, it could be one or two people, but the 350 million people in the U.S., there'll be like 3 that agree with you. No, it's a minority. Let's put it that way.
The regulation can be good for.
I knew you were going to go there. So you think regulation is good?
I think regulation can be good for everyone. I think properly tailored regulation can provide consumers rights that they should have, and provide industry certainty about what they are allowed to and not allowed to do, and raise everybody's game in terms of the way they develop and test software and models in the case of AI.
Do you think our government is capable of embodying the definition you just gave?
Yes.
Okay. So you're positive.
Here's one of the things that makes it more complicated. I think when we talk about AI, every different industry looks at what we mean by AI very differently. So if you talk to the entertainment industry, when they think of AI, they think of their copyrighted material being used to train a system and then compete with it. If you talk to my relatives, they will think about it in terms of social media and what prioritizes what they see in their social media feeds. If you talk to public interest groups, they will think about the potential for discriminatory effects. If you talk to national security folks, they'll think about competition with China. Everybody thinks about it differently. And as a result, it's one of these situations where a buzzword can mean something really different to a lot of different people, and we talk past each other. And that's true within government and outside of government. And I think that makes it harder to get everybody on the same page and get the responsible view of regulation that I think we can achieve.
How many times have you presented on the congressional floor?
I've testified before Congress 3 times.
3 times. Were you nervous?
I used to prepare my boss for hearings and sit behind the chair. So you get used to it, and as long as you answer questions honestly, everything goes smoothly.
Do you think the questions are fair?
Yes, I think in a number of situations where I've spoken to members of Congress, I feel like they're trying to understand an issue better when they have 1,000 different things that they have to do. And we might think about AI and digital policy all the time. They have to think about healthcare and taxes and the budget and their constituents and a whole bunch of things that are not AI regulation. So one of the reasons that I used to recommend hearings when I was working on the Judiciary Committee on any specific topic was in order to help focus members of the committee on those issues, because we were looking to legislate on them. And we thought that having members of the committee ask questions of witnesses will help them be prepared as legislation moves forward and understand the various different perspectives. And I think they really do try to do that. And sometimes it's challenging because there are so many competing demands on their time.
You don't think it's a lot of grandstanding?
I think on the issues that we work on, there's really not a lot of partisan advantage that comes with it. It's more trying to get it right, and they're going to have competing interests in their districts or states, because they've got a content industry player, and they've got a technology developer, and they've got constituents that want to make sure all this works right for them. So they're often going to have a variety of different perspectives, and they need to balance them all.
What's the most enjoyable thing about your job?
I think working with the member companies, and particularly because the technology continues to develop so quickly that it means that the policy issues really haven't completely gelled yet. Some have, and we have proposed solutions for them. Mm-hmm. Some really have not, and trying to identify what those issues are going to be is very enjoyable.
What do you do for fun?
Spend as much time with my wife and daughter as I can.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wine, bourbon, dinner.
Yeah, I try not to list whiskey as a hobby.
Yeah, but when you do it as well as I do, you gotta list it. That's probably smart, though. Hey, thank you, Aaron, for being here. You thought it was gonna be boring. I thought it was fantastic.
It was great, but like you said, like if this were a conversation in a bar, then with the whiskey, it would be even better.
Well, we'll do that next time. We just don't want to tell anybody that we're drinking the whiskey. All right, fantastic. Thank you, listeners, for listening. Hit us on almartintalksdata@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. Please rate us wherever you may be. We appreciate that as well. We don't get as many ratings as we should. We got a lot of listeners out there, but please take the time. It means a lot. And let us know who you'd like to have on the podcast. Until next time, we'll see you on the podcast.